Rain lashed against the windows of Detective Carter's small office. She was already on her second cup of tea, the bitter taste mirroring the grim weather outside. A constable arrived, bringing a sense of urgency with him as he entered.
"From Reddington Manor, ma'am," he said.
Detective Carter recognized the name. Reddington Manor was a grand estate, home to the wealthy and recently widowed Mrs. Reddington. She opened the letter and quickly scanned its contents. Her eyes widened. Mrs. Reddington had been found dead in her swimming pool. The local police suspected foul play.
"Prepare the carriage," she instructed the constable, her voice sharp and alert. "We leave for Reddington Manor immediately."
A knot of anticipation, a mixture of dread and excitement, settled in her stomach. This was no ordinary drowning. This was murder, and Detective Carter was determined to unravel its secrets. As the carriage lurched forward, Detective Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Reddington Manor, with its imposing facade and sprawling grounds, held a dark secret, and she, Detective Carter, was about to step into its midst. The journey to Reddington Manor had begun. Reddington Manor loomed before her, a gothic silhouette against the stormy sky. Detective Carter stepped out of the carriage, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. The swimming pool, an extravagance in these times, was an enclosed structure attached to the manor. Mrs. Reddington's lifeless body lay on a stretcher by the poolside, covered by a white sheet. She lifted the sheet, her face betraying no emotion, as she examined the victim. This was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to resemble a tragedy. Detective Carter's gaze settled on the three individuals standing nervously at the edge of the pool area, each one a suspect, each with their own secrets hidden beneath a veneer of grief. Then there was Albert, the butler, a fixture at Reddington Manor for as long as anyone could remember.
"Tell me," Detective Carter began, her voice calm and steady, "what each of you were doing this afternoon."
Harry, tall and lanky, shifted uncomfortably under Detective Carter's gaze. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a petulant air.
"I was out riding, Detective," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "Didn't know a thing until Albert came running up, shouting about Aunt Millie."
Detective Carter made a note in her small notebook. Harry's alibi was flimsy at best. There was no one to corroborate his story, and his reliance on his aunt's wealth was well known. She knew that the truth often lay in the details, and Harry's story had too many gaps. Albert the butler stood stiffly, his face a mask of grief. He was an older man, his hair silvering at the temples, his face etched with the lines of a life spent in service. He had been with Mrs. Reddington for decades, a silent observer to the comings and goings of the manor.
"I was preparing Mrs. Reddington's afternoon tea, Detective. She liked it precisely at 4 o'clock. Earl Grey, no sugar, a splash of milk."
He recited the details with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual countless times.
"And when you went to deliver the tea?"
The pool room door was open. I saw her there, floating in the water. I couldn't believe it.
He brought a shaky hand to his forehead, his composure threatening to crack. Detective Carter observed him closely. Albert's grief seemed genuine. He had been a loyal servant to Mrs. Reddington, his life intertwined with hers. But loyalty, Detective Carter knew, could be a powerful motivator. Had Albert, for reasons yet unknown, turned against his mistress? The butler's story was consistent, but something felt off. Detective Carter's instincts told her to dig deeper. She needed to find the missing piece of the puzzle. The truth was often hidden in plain sight. Miles Henry, a slight man with thinning hair and a nervous disposition, was the last to be questioned. He fidgeted under Detective Carter's scrutiny, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route.
"I was reviewing Mrs. Reddington's finances, Detective, as I do every Tuesday afternoon."
"And where were you when the body was discovered?"
"Still in the study, reviewing the ledgers. I didn't even know anything was wrong until the constable came and told me."
Detective Carter noticed a bead of sweat trickling down Miles Henry's temple. He was a man accustomed to dealing with numbers, not murder investigations. His unease was palpable. But was it the unease of a guilty man, or simply the fear of an innocent caught in a web of suspicion?
"And how were Mrs. Reddington's finances?"
In order, Mrs. Reddington was a very meticulous woman.
Detective Carter made a mental note to examine Mrs. Reddington's financial records. Money, she knew, was a common motive for murder. Had Miles Henry, driven by greed or desperation, silenced the one person who held the key to his financial security? The accountant's nervousness was telling. Detective Carter sensed that he was hiding something. She needed to uncover the truth behind his facade. The investigation was intensifying. Detective Carter sat at a table in the Manor's grand dining room, her notes spread out before her. The testimonies of the three suspects swirled in her mind, each one a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Harry, the ungrateful heir, with a flimsy alibi and a possible motive. Albert, the loyal butler, his grief palpable but his true nature a mystery. And Miles Henry, the nervous accountant, his unease suggesting a secret he desperately wanted to keep hidden. She reviewed the timeline of events, searching for inconsistencies, for any detail that could provide a break in the case, and then she found it. A discrepancy in Albert's account. He claimed to have been preparing Mrs. Reddington's tea at the precise moment she was most likely murdered. But the tea set, laid out on a silver tray in the drawing room, told a different story. The tea was cold, the milk slightly curdled. It had been sitting there for hours, untouched. A slow smile spread across Detective Carter's face. Albert, the faithful servant, had lied. But why? What was he trying to hide? The answer, she suspected, lay in the depths of Reddington Manor, hidden among the secrets and lies that clung to its inhabitants like cobwebs. Armed with this new information, Detective Carter decided to revisit the scene of the crime. She stood by the pool, her gaze sweeping over every detail. The air was still heavy with the scent of chlorine and something else, something she couldn't quite place. And then she saw it.
A small, almost imperceptible smudge on the edge of the pool.
She crouched down, examining it more closely. It was a faint, oily residue, almost invisible to the naked eye. She recognized it instantly.
Lanolin, a common ingredient in hand creams.
But Mrs. Reddington was not known for using such things. Her hands, Detective Carter recalled from examining the body, were smooth and unblemished, the hands of a woman unaccustomed to manual labor. A picture began to form in Detective Carter's mind.
Albert, she knew, suffered from chronically dry hands. He was often seen applying hand cream, his weathered hands a stark contrast to the pristine white gloves he wore when serving. Could this smudge of lanolin be the missing link, the clue that connected Albert to the murder? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together.
Detective Carter summoned Albert to the drawing room. He entered, his face etched with concern, his hands clasped behind his back. Detective Carter watched him closely, her expression unreadable.
Albert, we need to talk about the tea.
Albert's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly recovered his composure.
Of course, Detective. Is there something wrong with it?
The tea, Albert, was cold. It had been sitting there for hours. You weren't preparing it at the time you claimed to be.
Albert's face paled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out.
And this is lanolin, found on the edge of the pool. It seems our meticulous murderer forgot to consider the finer details. The evidence was overwhelming. Albert's guilt was becoming increasingly apparent.
Albert's shoulders slumped, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before Detective Carter's eyes. He sank into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands.
It was the will, Detective. Mrs. Reddington, she was changing it, cutting me out entirely. All those years of service, and for what? To be tossed aside like an old shoe.
He looked up at Detective Carter, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperation.
I didn't mean to kill her. It was an accident. I just wanted to scare her, make her see reason, but she fought back. And then she was gone.
Detective Carter listened to Albert's confession, her expression impassive. She'd seen it all before. The desperation, the justifications, the desperate attempts to rationalize the unthinkable. But murder, no matter the motive, was still murder. The weight of evidence was undeniable. Albert's fate was sealed. The case was nearing its conclusion. Justice would be served. The rain had stopped and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the manor. Detective Carter watched as Albert, his head bowed, was led away by the constables. The case was closed, the truth revealed, but there was no sense of triumph, only a lingering sadness. As she prepared to leave Reddington Manor, she noticed Harry and Miles Henry standing by the window, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. They had been spared the fate intended for them, but the events of the past few days had left an indelible mark on their lives.
Let this be a lesson to you both. Greed and envy are dangerous companions. They can lead you down a dark path, a path from which there is no return.
And with that, Detective Carter turned and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving the shadows of Reddington Manor behind her. The case was closed, but the memory of the woman who had lost her life in the pursuit of justice would stay with her. A reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of even the most seemingly idyllic lives.